Hey guys, welcome to a new episode of my podcast. This is going to be my personal project. For the project, we had to follow like a theme, and the theme was a legacy of innovation. Now on Google it says innovation is the action or process of innovating, which doesn't give you much, but to get an idea, it's like getting ideas right and evolving, right? So the way something changes and starts new stuff. All right, that's my definition of it. All right, now one of the things I'm most interested in is superheroes. So I decided to talk about that because over time superheroes have changed, a lot, and I thought that the evolution of superheroes would be a cool thing to talk about on the podcast since I rarely do podcast episodes. All right, I'm gonna stop blabbering now. Now, if we wanted to go all the way back to the beginning, the biggest place where superheroes probably developed from is like ancient Greece and Egypt and stuff like that, where there were tales of gods and stuff. It was really crazy. Mainly the Greek gods, or the Roman gods, is what people know today, because those are the ones we have evidence of. But most people nowadays know superheroes like the classics, Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, and the modern superheroes mostly come from comic books, right? And comic books first began appearing in the late 1800s, very late 1800s and early 1900s, and superheroes wore really colorful costumes. They were like a way of superheroes back then were known as mass vigilantes of the American Old West. There was a bunch of little comic book superheroes that not many people know today, like the San Diego Vigilantes and the Bald Knobbers. Superhero comic books were popularized around World War II. World War II was a big thing for the United States because at first they were not going to get involved, but when they did decide to get involved, propaganda started popping up everywhere. And as people read these comic books about superheroes, the government began implementing kind of like messages into the comic books, right? So there's like comic books of Superman fighting Nazis, and the comic books became more of a wider thing across America and across the world, I guess, eventually. Now, as we're speaking about World War II, the superhero that mainly started this whole comic book frenzy was Superman, right? He's probably in some people's opinions the best superhero, or maybe the most well-known superhero, as he's kind of iconic everywhere. You could tell a little baby that's Superman, and yeah, it's Superman. Superman popularized the genre of superhero comic books, and Superman was created in 1938, which is right around the time World War II was happening, by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right. Superman was created by those two while they were still in high school, so you kind of have that kid's imagination to play around with. And Superman, since Superman's creation, he's been one of the staple household names. Everybody knows who Superman is. He's kind of I've already said this, iconic, right? And after that, soon after Superman's creation, DC Comics, one of the most well-known superhero companies, has began just making new superheroes, right? So you got Batman, one of the biggest ones, right? You got the Flash. You have a lot of them, right? And over the years, more and more began popping up as comic books became more popular. There was more people to buy and more to sell. And in 1939, Marvel Comics, at that time, Marvel Comics did not go by Marvel. Marvel Comics went by Timely Comics, which they later changed their name to Marvel, made their first comic book, surprisingly using the Human Torch, which is not is not their main most well known. But yeah, that's kind of interesting to think about how Marvel's first superhero was the Human Torch, a man made of fire. Now, going back to the topic of World War II, Captain America was actually made in 1941, which was like around the middle of World War II, which is really interesting because he's like the face of America, and the U.S. used him as a way to combat him. Fight against Hitler. I'm sorry, I forgot who World War II was caused by for a second. And as I said before, around that time of World War II, a lot of superheroes were created. Some that I can talk about is Batman, who is now like famously known, was made in 1939. Shazam, 1939. The Flash was made in 1940. Aquaman, 1941. Wonder Woman, 1941. Supergirl, 1950. My bad. And as we can see, in the U.S., comic books would become a big thing as people hearing about the war would go to the store and see Superman fighting a Nazi, right? And they would want to pick it up. And yeah, the little kids became interested in these superheroes. And well, I'm gonna move away from the war for a moment. The main two well-known companies for superheroes is obviously Marvel and DC, as they are some of the biggest. They have some of the biggest names. But surprisingly, Marvel didn't really start creating most of their iconic heroes until the 1960s, which is when Stan Lee began working for them, right? They had the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Iron Man, the X-Men, Wolverine. There's just a bunch of them that came out in the 1960s, which is when Marvel really started taking off, and that's when DC kind of realized that it wasn't just them in the business and they had more competition. Now, as these two companies both got bigger, you would see them kind of competing, right? They would be competing for the market, right? And so you wouldn't see them directly rip off characters, but you would see Marvel ripoffs of DC characters and DC ripoffs of Marvel characters, and it kind of became this competition. And obviously there were other like comic book companies, but I'm just talking about the two main ones, as they've been the ones that stuck around this whole time. Now, these superheroes would become popularized by these children because eventually these superheroes started turning into more than just like little fictional stories. These superheroes began being kind of relatable, and that kind of started with Spider-Man, right? Now, the main reason I'm doing this podcast about superheroes is because, I like Spider-Man, and I have Spider-Man things everywhere. That's because Spider-Man means something more than just a guy who can stick to walls, right? And that's what some of these kids began seeing in these superheroes. They began looking up to these heroes, wanting to be more like them. And they were kind of like a good example to the children. That's why they were popularized, right? Because the parents would see these superheroes helping people, and they'd be like, well, yeah, that's good for the children. And it is. Now, obviously, we all know that DC and Marvel are not the only superhero creators around, right? There's a bunch of big name superheroes that people just don't think of, like the Ninja Turtles began in the 1980s, and those are some big names. We also know the Power Rangers, right? Also came out in the 1900s, and even though this wasn't a 1900s thing, the Incredibles. There's a bunch of superheroes that people just don't think of because of, Marvel and DC, but there are so many different types of superheroes that were created over the years as the market expanded and companies saw that the people liked these superheroes, these idols. They began creating more of them. Everyone has a superhero now. Now, superheroes eventually developed from more than just comic books, obviously, because nowadays we have movies, TV shows, spin-offs of TV shows, we have merchandise, we have everything, because like I said, these superheroes became real popular with everybody. even adults were able to somehow like these stories. And yeah, that's when movies began happening, right? Now, obviously, before all these superheroes were created, there were superheroes movies, but these superhero movies were seen as kind of, campy, like a little too goofy, but they weren't exactly like children's movies either. So it was like a kind of like a weird middle spot where no one really liked superhero movies. It wasn't really that popular, and yeah. But after a certain point, right, superhero movies just started becoming real popular, which is how we got here today. Like in the 1980s is when most superhero movies became happening, right? We have most like sci-fi movies weren't really that popular until after Star Wars, which Star Wars is a big like sci-fi supernatural type thing, and people really like Star Wars, and these companies just realized, hey, we can do that too, right, with our own superheroes. So superheroes movies became popping up. Obviously Superman had a movie, then everyone needed to have a movie. So we had Batman movies, we had Spider-Man movies, we had just a bunch, just Ninja Turtle movies. Like, there were so many different types of movies coming out because these companies realized they could do more than just make comic books. They started making merchandise and started collaborating with different types of companies, just trying to get everybody to buy their stuff, which is honestly not a bad strategy. I mean, if people like it, they like it, just sell it. Then that leads us into like the 2000s, where in the 2000s many what's it called in the 2000s, many of those superheroes that were created were already like 60 years old. Superman was 60 years old when the 2000s started. So, these things kind of like evolved over time to more than just comic books, right? There was the 2000s, more technology, more things could be done, better movies, better action figures, better everything, right? Because these companies now had more access to materials and things that they could use to make products. Now, in 2008, which is the year I was born, actually, in 2008, Iron Man came out. Now, Iron Man was not the first superhero movie that did really well, actually. There was a bunch of like X-Men movies before that. Spider-Man 1 through 3 was pretty big before 2008. But in Iron Man, we saw the beginning of something that no one could ever like really imagine, right? Now, in the comic books, all these superhero stories were connected, but in the movies, these were standalone movies that each superhero had, right? But Iron Man began the Marvel Cinematic Universe, also known as the MCU, and the MCU is now one of the biggest things ever, right? Now, in the 2000s, Marvel was bought off by Disney, right? Marvel was not doing pretty well. They were actually doing pretty bad. They were running out of money, and they began selling their properties, their characters. So Spider-Man was sold off to Sony. The Hulk was sold off to Universal, right? These superheroes that were pretty popular were being sold off to these companies that were not superhero companies. And so, even though Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3 were pretty good by Sony, right? Marvel was bought by Disney, and they began doing movies, right? Because Disney is one of the biggest companies, right? Now, there's a lot of debate because Disney is like a kids type thing. So maybe these superheroes that were more on the darker side wouldn't get the type of film they deserved, or the type of show they deserved. By the way, I'm sorry if I'm messing up a lot. It's just I'm recording this in one go, and since it's a podcast, like, I'm not really supposed to, pause and stuff. But yeah. Now, these movies began bringing These movies began bringing these superheroes, these idols, these icons, closer to a more larger audience, as movie theaters were now more popular. More people wanted to go see these awesome movies. The trailers were looking better, and it was brought to a larger audience since, Disney's name was behind it. Okay, so now that brings us on to modern day, and in modern day, superheroes are one of the biggest things ever. They are everywhere. Every store, you're gonna find something to do with superheroes, and it's honestly kind of inspiring because, all of this started from some high schoolers making a random guy with superpowers during high school, right? And, it's just really interesting to think about how from, like, comic books, from, like, old tales in Greece started these things that will now last for hopefully the rest of eternity, as new generations will see these heroes as more than idols. These superheroes grew into something bigger than we could have ever imagined.